February 1727. The Strait of Gibraltar. A solitary figure stands atop the North Bastion, surveying the narrow tongue of land connecting the Rock to Spain. Brigadier General Richard Kane, 65 years old, watches the dust clouds rising from Spanish camp fires. 12,000 enemy soldiers, modern siege artillery, determined engineers inching their trenches forward through the sandy isthmus, meter by bloody meter. Against this formidable host, Kane commands barely 1,500 men, a skeletal garrison of worn regiments, hastily assembled gunners, and nervous militiamen who've never faced proper siege warfare. The Spanish trenches now run to within 50 yards of British defenses. Their batteries hammer the ancient Moorish walls day and night. King Philip V of Spain has staked his reputation on recapturing this stubborn limestone fortress that has humiliated Spanish pride for 23 years. The odds are impossible. The outcome, by any rational calculation, predetermined. Yet, 6 months later, it will be Spain that withdraws, defeated. Not a single Spanish soldier will set foot inside Gibraltar's walls. How did this happen? How did a garrison commander with no reinforcements, minimal supplies, and troops outnumbered 8-1 hold one of Europe's most strategic fortresses against the full weight of Spanish military power? The answer lies not in luck, not in divine intervention, but in the extraordinary military genius of a man history has almost entirely forgotten. An Ulsterman born to a dispossessed Gaelic Catholic family, who anglicized his name to fight for Protestant kings. A soldier wounded at Blenheim under Marlborough, who wrote the manual that became the British Army's tactical Bible. A colonial administrator who transformed a barren Mediterranean island into a model of enlightened governance. Richard Kane served 4 British monarchs across 5 decades of nearly continuous warfare. He fortified Gibraltar when it was most vulnerable. He defended it when attack came. He wrote treatises that influenced British infantry tactics for generations. Yet today, whilst we remember Wellington and Nelson, Marlborough and Clive, Kane's name has vanished from popular memory, known only to specialists in 18th century military history. Tonight, we resurrect the reputation of Britain's most underappreciated military mind, the silent genius who saved Gibraltar when it mattered most, and whose innovations in tactics, fortification, and colonial administration deserve recognition alongside the celebrated commanders who overshadow him. This is the story of Colonel Richard Kane, Gibraltar's forgotten defender. December 1662, Duneen, County Antrim, Ulster. Into the twilight world of Restoration Ireland, Richard O'Cahan was born a child of contradiction from the moment of his first breath. His father, Thomas O'Cahan, descended from one of Ulster's ancient Gaelic Catholic families, once lords of considerable lands before Cromwell's devastations. His mother, Margaret Dobbin, came from Presbyterian stock. The marriage itself represented the impossible compromises that characterized Ulster society. Catholic tradition meeting Protestant practicality in a province still scarred by rebellion and reconquest. Young Richard grew up in a countryside thick with recent memory. The 1641 Rising, Cromwell's brutal pacification, the redistribution of ancient clan lands to English and Scottish settlers. The O'Cahans had survived, but barely clinging to respectability through advantageous marriages and careful navigation of Ireland's treacherous religious politics. It was a childhood that taught essential lessons: the necessity of adaptation, the art of survival in hostile environments, and the understanding that identity itself could be a matter of strategic choice rather than fixed inheritance. When revolution came to Britain in 1688, as Catholic King James II's authority collapsed and Protestant William of Orange claimed the throne, 26-year-old Richard O'Cahan made the decision that would define his life. He changed his name to Richard Kane. He joined a volunteer Protestant regiment raised in his hometown of Carrickfergus. He chose his allegiance. It was at Londonderry in 1689 that Kane received what his Westminster Abbey memorial later called his military apprenticeship in the famous siege. For 105 days, a makeshift Protestant garrison held the walled city against King James's Catholic army. Kane, a newly commissioned lieutenant, witnessed siege warfare at its most desperate: starvation, disease, artillery bombardment, the psychological pressure of encirclement. The city's survival came within days, perhaps hours, of collapse before relief ships finally broke through the river barricades. The experience branded itself onto Kane's consciousness. He learned that sieges are won as much by engineering and logistics as by courage, that fortifications poorly maintained become death traps, that morale, supply lines, and methodical preparation matter more than dramatic gestures. These lessons would echo through his entire career. After Londonderry's relief, Kane transferred to the Earl of Meath's regiment, later designated the 18th Regiment of Foot, the Royal Irish. He fought at the Boyne in 1690, where William III crushed James's hopes of recovering his throne. He endured the grinding siege of Limerick that same year, again witnessing how fortifications and persistence could frustrate superior numbers. But it was William's continental campaigns that truly forged Kane's military expertise. From 1691 onwards, he served in Flanders, the cockpit of European warfare, where French, Dutch, English, Spanish, and imperial armies maneuvered in the Low Countries' soggy fields and fortress towns. Here he learned from the best military minds of the age. At the Siege of Namur in 1695, Kane's regiment distinguished itself sufficiently to earn official recognition from King William. The Royal Irish fought in the breaches, took appalling casualties, and held positions under artillery fire that pulverized stone and flesh alike. Kane himself was wounded seriously enough to require extended convalescence, but not severely enough to end his career. He returned to service hardened, experienced, and crucially noticed by his superiors as an officer who understood not merely courage but craft. In an army still dominated by purchase of commissions and aristocratic patronage, Kane was becoming that rarest of creatures, a professional soldier valued for competence rather than connections. When William III died in 1702 and Queen Anne ascended the throne, Europe plunged into the War of Spanish Succession, a conflict that would rage for 11 years and determine whether France or the Grand Alliance would dominate the continent. John Churchill, Duke of Marlborough, took command of Allied forces. Richard Kane, now a seasoned captain, would serve through Marlborough's legendary campaigns. On 13 August 1704, at a village called Blenheim on the Danube, Kane participated in what many historians consider Marlborough's masterpiece, a battle that broke French military power and saved Vienna from conquest. The Royal Irish fought in the center, enduring French artillery and repeated cavalry charges. Kane was severely wounded, his second serious combat injury, testimony to his habit of leading from the front rather than directing from the rear. As he convalesced, Marlborough's genius was reshaping European warfare. Kane studied it obsessively, the Duke's use of combined arms, his mastery of logistics that enabled rapid maneuvers, his ability to coordinate multinational armies, his tactical innovations that replaced rigid linear tactics with flexible, aggressive attack. All of it, Kane absorbed, analyzed, and later incorporated into his own military thinking. He returned to the colors for the subsequent campaigns: Ramillies in 1706, Oudenarde in 1708, Malplaquet in 1709, each battle a butcher's yard, where Kane learned that victory's price could be measured in shattered regiments and permanent disability. The Royal Irish bled themselves nearly dry in Marlborough's service. In December 1710, Queen Anne named Kane colonel of his own regiment, the former command of George Macartney, who had fallen from grace after killing the Duke of Hamilton in a duel. It was recognition Kane had earned through 20 years of service, multiple wounds, and demonstrated competence. At 48, he finally held independent command, but triumph came mixed with disappointment. In 1711, Kane sailed with a massive expedition under General Jack Hill to capture Quebec from the French, a strategic stroke that would secure Canada for Britain. The campaign ended in catastrophic failure when poor navigation wrecked 7 transports and a store ship in the St. Lawrence River, drowning 850 soldiers in one of the worst disasters in British maritime history. Kane visited Boston during the expedition's preparations, but the debacle itself must have reinforced his conviction that careful preparation and sound logistics mattered more than bold gestures. The following year brought another disaster, this one Kane could not avoid. He commanded British troops ordered to occupy Dunkirk under treaty arrangements. An epidemic struck. Half his men died of fever in the disease-ridden port. It was brutal education in military medicine's limitations and the danger of garrison duty in unhealthy climates. Yet from this nadir came unexpected opportunity. In 1712, Queen Anne appointed the Duke of Argyll governor of the newly captured island of Minorca, seized from Spain in 1708, and formally ceded to Britain under peace treaty negotiations. Argyll, however, had no intention of actually residing on a remote Mediterranean island. He needed a capable deputy. He chose Richard Kane. On 10 November 1712, at age 50, Kane arrived in Mahon Harbor as lieutenant governor of Minorca. It would become his life's work and the foundation for everything that followed. For 8 years, Kane governed Minorca with an enlightened competence that astounded contemporaries. Against church opposition, he reformed the legal system and drew up a new constitution. He constructed a magnificent road, the Camí d'en Can, connecting the old Spanish capital of Ciutadella with Mahon, transforming an island hitherto impassable into one where wheeled transport could move freely. He introduced new agricultural methods, imported improved cattle breeds, and planted drought-resistant clover to feed them. He treated the predominantly Spanish and Catholic population with remarkable fairness for the age, learning their language, respecting their customs, and administering justice even-handedly. He modernized weights and measures. He made Mahon a free port, stimulating trade. He built reservoirs and improved gin production. Minorca prospered. The islanders, initially suspicious of British occupation, came to respect their Irish Protestant governor, who ruled with firmness but without tyranny. Then in 1720, King George I summoned Kane to Gibraltar. Intelligence reports warned of Spanish preparations for a surprise attack on the rock. Diplomatic tensions were rising. The Peace of Utrecht in 1713 had formally ceded Gibraltar to Britain, but Spain had never reconciled itself to the loss. Gibraltar commanded the strait between Atlantic and Mediterranean. Whoever held it could choke maritime trade and naval movements. Its symbolic value to Spanish pride exceeded even its strategic importance. Kane arrived to find a fortress in shocking disrepair. The original Spanish fortifications, built over centuries of Moorish and Christian construction, had been patched rather than properly maintained. Artillery positions lacked proper embrasures. Powder magazines were dangerously exposed. The walls showed cracks and weak points. The garrison was undermanned and poorly supplied. Working at ferocious pace, Kane strengthened the defenses. He directed construction of new batteries overlooking the isthmus, the narrow land bridge connecting Gibraltar to Spain, which represented the only practical avenue for assault. He repositioned artillery for interlocking fields of fire. He stockpiled ammunition and provisions. He drilled the garrison relentlessly in defensive procedures. His assessment was stark. Gibraltar could withstand siege, but only if properly prepared. The rock's geography provided natural strength. Sheer cliffs on the eastern face made assault from the Mediterranean side virtually impossible. But the isthmus offered attackers firm ground for siege works, and Spanish artillery positioned there could systematically pound British defenses. Kane's reforms came not a moment too soon. In February 1720, Spanish forces did indeed threaten attack, but seeing the strengthened defenses and increased readiness, they withdrew without committing to full siege. Kane's rapid fortification work had deterred Spanish action by making the cost of assault unacceptably high. King George I rewarded Kane with the colonelcy of a prestigious regiment later designated the 9th Regiment of Foot. Kane returned to Minorca, his reputation as a defensive engineer and fortress commander firmly established. For 5 years, he continued his enlightened governance of the island, beloved by the population and respected throughout the Mediterranean as an exceptional colonial administrator. But in February 1725, the king summoned him to Gibraltar once more. This time, the threat was far more serious. Spain and Britain were sliding toward war. The complex diplomacy of European power politics, rivalries between Spain, France, Austria, and Britain had created a situation where Philip V of Spain felt emboldened to attempt the recapture of Gibraltar by force. The Spanish king had never forgiven Britain for the theft of Spanish territory and saw recovering Gibraltar as essential to endured national honor. Kane, now 63 years old, arrived in February 1725 with orders to strengthen Gibraltar's defenses and prepare for siege. He had 18 months. He used every day. Working with manic energy that exhausted men half his age, Kane transformed Gibraltar's fortifications. He repaired walls. He constructed new artillery emplacements. He improved the water supply critical for withstanding prolonged siege. He expanded magazines. He drilled the garrison in defensive tactics he had learned across 40 years of warfare. Crucially, he also recommended political changes. Gibraltar, Kane argued, needed civil government, a structure of administration that would give the polyglot civilian population a stake in British rule. Military governance alone could not sustain the Rock's defense. The inhabitants needed reasons to support British retention beyond the point of bayonets. It was characteristic of Kane's thinking. Defense was not merely military but political, economic, and psychological. Fortifications mattered, but so did legitimacy. In February 1727, just as Kane prepared to return to Minorca, the blow fell. Spanish forces laid siege to Gibraltar, the 13th siege in the Rock's history, the second mounted by Spain since British capture in 1704. The Marquis de Verboom, Spain's most talented military engineer, commanded 12,000 troops. His artillery train included the latest siege guns. His sappers were skilled, experienced, and equipped with modern equipment. Spanish nobility regarded participating in Gibraltar's recapture as a point of honor. Young officers competed for the glory of planting Spain's flag atop the Rock. Against this host, Kane commanded 1,500 men drawn from 4 depleted regiments, the 5th, 6th, 34th, and 39th Foot. Many were recent recruits. Ammunition was adequate but not abundant. Provisions were sufficient for perhaps 6 months of siege. Reinforcement by sea depended on the Royal Navy maintaining control of the strait, never guaranteed when Spanish and French fleets might combine. Kane's situation was, in a word, desperate. The geography determined everything. Gibraltar's eastern face, the Mediterranean side, offered no approach for attackers. Sheer cliffs, 700 feet high, made assault impossible. The southern tip similarly dropped to the sea in impassable rock faces. The western side, facing the bay, could theoretically be approached by sea, but Royal Navy control of the strait made amphibious assault suicidal. That left only the isthmus, a funnel of sandy ground barely half a mile wide at its narrowest point, running between the sea on the west and the towering north face of the Rock on the east. This was where Verboom would attack. There was nowhere else. Kane understood the tactical geometry perfectly. The Spanish would dig approach trenches, advancing by the classic methods of siege warfare, parallels, and saps inching closer each night. Artillery batteries erected at intervals to suppress defensive fire. Eventually they would reach the British forward defenses, storm them, and then face the main walls. On 22 February 1727, Spanish engineers began their trenches. Kane's response demonstrated the tactical brilliance he had developed across decades of warfare. He refused to allow passive defense. Each night, as Spanish sappers dug their trenches forward, British raiding parties sallied from the gates to attack the works, spike guns, and kill engineers. The Spanish, expecting defenders to cower behind walls, found themselves engaged in brutal night fighting. Kane personally organized these sorties, selecting officers and men for courage and initiative, timing the attacks for maximum disruption, and ensuring each raid had clear objectives rather than simply gesturing at aggression. His men destroyed Spanish artillery positions. They set fire to siege materials. They forced Spanish commanders to divert troops to guard their trenches rather than focus entirely on offensive operations. The garrison's gunnery, trained under Kane's relentless drilling, proved devastatingly accurate. British cannon fire crashed into Spanish positions with precision that shocked observers. Kane had positioned his batteries to create overlapping fields of fire anywhere. Spanish forces appeared. British artillery could reach them. Most crucially, Kane maintained morale. He ensured fair ration distribution. He rotated troops to prevent exhaustion. He visited every position regularly, speaking to soldiers, learning their concerns, and demonstrating that their commander understood siege warfare intimately. Men who might have despaired under a lesser commander instead took confidence from Kane's competence. Through March and April, the siege ground on. Spanish trenches reached to within 50 yards of British positions. Artillery duels raged daily. Casualties mounted slow, grinding attrition that wore down defenders and attackers alike. According to campaign records, by May the Spanish had lost over 1,000 men killed, wounded, or fallen to disease. The British garrison suffered 300 casualties. Proportionally, the defenders were bleeding at a lower rate, but Kane's force was far smaller. Every loss hurt. Yet Spanish morale was cracking. Expected to overwhelm an undermanned garrison quickly, Verboom's troops instead faced weeks of brutal siege work with no end in sight. The rocky ground made digging trenches exhausting. British raids disrupted sleep and destroyed equipment. Artillery fire turned siege positions into killing zones. Most demoralizing of all was the geographical reality. Even if Spanish forces captured the forward positions, they would still face Gibraltar's main walls, defended by a garrison that showed no sign of weakening. The rock itself, 700 feet of limestone rising behind the Roy. Fortifications made complete conquest seem impossible. By June, Spanish commanders were in disarray. Some urged intensified assault. Others argued for withdrawal. Philip V, desperate for victory, pressed for continuation. But even royal determination could not overcome tactical reality. On 23 June 1727, Spain offered negotiations. The siege was lifted. Not a single Spanish soldier had breached Gibraltar's walls. Spain had lost approximately 1,400 men. Britain had suffered around 300 casualties. The garrison's discipline, Kane's defensive preparations, and the geographical impossibility of the position had combined to make Spanish victory unattainable. It was one of the most decisive defensive victories of the 18th century and one of the least remembered. Kane returned to Minorca in triumph, though he characteristically avoided public celebration. He had done what he was sent to do, save Gibraltar. The methods: careful preparation, aggressive defense, maintenance of morale, and exploitation of terrain were unremarkable to anyone who understood siege warfare. To Kane, this was simply professional soldiering done properly. But to the government in London, to naval commanders who depended on Gibraltar's anchorage, and to British strategists who recognized the rock's irreplaceable value, Kane had achieved something extraordinary. He had defended an undermanned fortress against overwhelming force and made it look almost routine. In 1733, at age 71, Richard Kane received formal appointment as governor of Minorca, no longer lieutenant governor acting on behalf of absent aristocrats, but the island's chief executive in his own right. King George II elevated him to the rank of brigadier general in 1735. The honors were recognition of a lifetime service, but Kane's most enduring contributions had already been made not through battles won or honors received, but through words written. Sometime in the late 1720s or early 1730s, Kane completed two works that would influence British military practice for decades: his campaigns of King William and the Duke of Marlborough, a detailed tactical analysis of the wars he had fought, and a new system of military discipline for a battalion of foot in action. The latter became what contemporaries called the British Army's Bible, the standard text for infantry tactics. Its influence cannot be overstated. Kane's manual codified lessons learned across 50 years of warfare. It explained how battalions should form for battle, how to conduct fire discipline, how to coordinate with cavalry and artillery, how to conduct defensive operations, and most innovatively, how to maintain flexibility rather than rigid linear formations. Where many military theorists of the period advocated mechanical precision, Kane emphasized adaptability. Infantry must be able to form square against cavalry, extend into line for firepower, or contract into column for movement, all whilst maintaining cohesion and responding to officers' commands. Tactics, Kane argued, must serve the situation rather than the situation conforming to preferred tactics. His discussions of logistics, camp discipline, and the care of soldiers were equally influential. Kane understood that armies marched on their stomachs and fought with their morale. Competent commanders ensured proper supply, fair treatment, and clear communication. Battles were won before they were fought, through preparation, training, and the maintenance of soldiers' confidence in their leadership. British commanders throughout the 1740s and 1750s referenced Kane's manual. His tactical prescriptions informed infantry training. His insights into siege warfare influenced fortress design. His emphasis on professional competence over aristocratic privilege contributed to the gradual professionalization of the officer corps. Yet even as his intellectual legacy spread through the army, Kane himself remained in Minorca, far from London's centers of power and prestige. He continued his enlightened governance. He maintained the roads. He adjudicated disputes. He ensured the island's fortifications remained battle-ready. He wrote occasional reports to the government, noting strategic developments in the Mediterranean and offering assessments of naval dispositions. It was quiet work, unglamorous work, but Kane had never sought glory. He sought effectiveness. On 31 December 1736, in Mahon, Richard Kane died. He was 74 years old. He had served Britain under four monarchs, William III, Anne, George I, and George II across nearly 50 years. He had fought in dozens of battles, been wounded multiple times, and governed British territories with remarkable competence. He had written manuals that shaped British military doctrine. He had saved Gibraltar when it mattered most. He died unmarried, leaving his considerable estate to his Dobbin cousins in Ulster, the family that had given him his mother's name and Presbyterian connections that enabled his initial military service. He was buried in the chapel of St. Philip's Castle, Minorca's great fortress. The chapel was later destroyed by Spanish bombardment, obliterating Kane's grave. But in Westminster Abbey, a memorial was raised not by government order but through private funds provided by Captain John Dobbin, one of Kane's heirs. The sculptor John Michael Rysbrack created a monument in white, gray, and black marble, featuring Kane's bust in armor. The lengthy Latin inscription detailed his achievements, from Londonderry to Minorca, emphasizing his service to 4 sovereigns and his exceptional competence in military and civil administration. The memorial's language is revealing. It praises Kane's shrewdness, courage, and dignity, his Christian faith, and old-fashioned courtesy. It emphasizes that he served more for the public good than for his own. It notes that he was elevated to governorship, neither by his own seeking nor with prior knowledge. A dig, perhaps, at more ambitious officers who schemed for advancement. Most tellingly, it records that Minorca, an island that was both British and Spanish, mourned his loss. For a military governor of an occupied territory to earn genuine affection from the subject population was exceptional. It testified to Kane's character and his governance philosophy. So why did history forget Richard Kane whilst remembering lesser figures? The answer lies partly in timing. Kane's greatest triumphs, the 1727 defense of Gibraltar and his Minorca governance, occurred during periods of relative peace that attracted less historical attention than major wars. Marlborough's campaigns overshadowed all other military achievements of the early 18th century. When historians wrote of Gibraltar, they focused on the Great Siege of 1779 to 1783, not the earlier and arguably more impressive defense of 1727. Kane also lacked the aristocratic connections that ensured other officers' reputations lived on. He wasn't a duke who commanded in chief. He wasn't politically powerful. He didn't cultivate London's elite or maneuver for prestigious appointments. He simply did his duty extraordinarily well, in unglamorous posts far from England. His writings, whilst influential among military professionals, never achieved popular readership. Military manuals don't make exciting reading for general audiences. His campaigns attracted interest from officers studying tactics, but not from the reading public. And crucially, Kane left no military dynasty, no family line of officers carrying his name forward, no network of protégés rising to high command whilst crediting their mentor. He died unmarried. His tactical innovations became absorbed into general practice, their origins forgotten as they became standard doctrine. Yet his contributions deserve recognition. Gibraltar remained British in 1727 because Kane's defensive preparations and tactical leadership made Spanish conquest impossibly costly. That fortress, in turn, gave Britain strategic control of Mediterranean access that proved crucial in subsequent wars. Every Royal Navy squadron that sheltered in Gibraltar's harbor, every convoy that passed safely through the strait, benefited from Kane's forgotten defense. His governance of Minorca demonstrated that colonial administration need not be exploitative or tyrannical. His road construction, agricultural improvements, and legal reforms showed that occupying powers could improve their subjects' lives rather than simply extracting wealth. It was a model of enlightened imperialism, deeply imperfect by modern standards but remarkably advanced for the 1710s and 1720s. His military manuals influenced British tactical development at a crucial period. The infantry that fought in the 7 Years' War, that held the line in North America and India, had learned tactics refined by Kane's teachings. His emphasis on flexibility, logistics, and morale anticipated reforms that later generations of officers would champion. Contemporary military historians who study early 18th century warfare recognize Kane's significance. His name appears in specialist studies of siege tactics, in analyses of Marlborough's campaigns, and in examinations of British colonial administration. Academic historians of the period understand his importance, but popular memory has erased him. Ask a British history enthusiast to name great military figures of the 18th century, and they'll mention Wolfe, Clive, Wellington, Gibraltar's defense brings to mind Eliot's heroic resistance during the Great Siege, not Kane's equally impressive earlier victory. This documentary represents an attempt at restoration, bringing Kane's story back into public consciousness, not from antiquarian interest, but because his achievements matter. He embodies qualities that military excellence requires: professional competence, careful preparation, tactical flexibility, and moral courage to do what's right rather than what's expedient. His career demonstrates that the most important military contributions are often the least celebrated. Defensive victories lack the drama of conquest. Colonial administration lacks the excitement of battlefield glory. Military writing lacks the appeal of heroic leadership. Yet each shapes military effectiveness as much as famous battles. Stand today at Gibraltar's northern defenses, looking across the isthmus toward Spain, and you're standing where Richard Kane's men held the line in 1727. The fortifications have changed. Later sieges brought further improvements. Modern construction has altered the ground, but the fundamental geography remains identical. The rock still dominates the strait. The isthmus still offers the only land approach. The tactical geometry that Kane exploited remains unchanged. Walk the Kane Road in Minorca, still bearing his name nearly 3 centuries after its construction, and you're following the route that transformed a divided island into a coherent territory. His greatest monument isn't in Westminster Abbey, but in the limestone paving and patient engineering that connected Ciutadella to Mahon, that enabled commerce and communication, that endured. The Rysbrack Memorial in Westminster Abbey stands in the north transept's west aisle, passed by thousands of visitors annually. Most never pause to read its inscription. Those who do encounter a name they don't recognize, achievements they've not heard described, a career that seems important but unfamiliar. Sacred to the memory of Richard Kane, the Latin reads, and then catalogues a lifetime of service across Europe's battlefields and Britain's imperial outposts, from Londonderry to Blenheim, from Flanders to Minorca, from crisis to crisis, wherever duty called, always competent, never celebrated. The memorial concludes with that haunting phrase, "Oh, oh, how uncertain is the life of man." It's a reminder that death erases even the most distinguished careers, that reputation proves fragile, that history forgets more than it remembers. But perhaps there's consolation in knowing that Kane's work mattered more than his fame. Gibraltar remained British because he defended it properly. Soldiers fought more effectively because he taught them better tactics. Minorcans lived under more just governance because he administered fairly. These are achievements that transcend individual recognition. Today's British Army studies siege warfare using case studies that include Kane's Gibraltar defense, though often without naming him directly. His tactical principles: prepare thoroughly, defend aggressively, maintain morale, exploit terrain, remain sound. Military historians researching early 18th century warfare consistently encounter his writings, his fortifications, and his administrative records. He exists in the historical record, richly documented for those who seek him. What he lacks is popular recognition, the cultural memory that elevates some historical figures into myth whilst leaving others in scholarly obscurity. Perhaps that's fitting. Kane was a soldier's soldier, an officer's officer, someone whose peers recognized his worth even if posterity forgot his name. He didn't seek glory. He sought effectiveness. He achieved it extraordinarily well. In the great narrative of British military history, we remember the dramatic conquests: India seized, Quebec captured, Waterloo won. We celebrate the commanders who led from the front, who achieved impossible victories, who became legends. But history is made equally by those who hold what's gained, who defend what must not be lost, who do the unglamorous work that enables everything else. Richard Kane was such a figure. Gibraltar might have fallen in 1727 without his preparations and leadership. That it didn't fall meant Britain retained strategic control of the Mediterranean access for subsequent centuries. Every conquest Clive achieved in India, depended on naval power that flowed through Gibraltar's harbor. Every campaign Wellington fought in the peninsula relied on supply lines protected by Gibraltar's guns. Every assertion of British naval dominance in the Mediterranean rested on the foundation of Gibraltar's impregnability, an impregnability Kane helped forge. So here's the paradox. Richard Kane's greatest achievement was enabling other people's victories. His success was measured in things that didn't happen. Gibraltar's fall, Minorca's rebellion, tactical disasters averted through proper training. These are difficult achievements to dramatize, hard to celebrate, easy to overlook. Yet they represent military excellence in its truest form. Not the glory of conquest, but the competence of preservation. Not the drama of battlefield heroism, but the steady professionalism of preparation and defense. Not the excitement of innovation, but the discipline of applying proven principles effectively. If we're to understand British military history honestly, we must recognize both the celebrated and the forgotten, both the conquerors and the defenders, both those who seized glory and those who simply did their duty extraordinarily well. Richard Kane belongs in this narrative not as a footnote but as an exemplar of military virtue that history too easily forgets. He was brilliant without being flashy, effective without being famous, essential without being celebrated. In the end, perhaps the memorial's Latin inscription captures it perfectly. A man concerned more for the public good than for his own, who served 4 sovereigns with unwavering competence, who saved Gibraltar when it mattered most, and who died leaving both territories in his care mourning his loss. History forgot Richard Kane, but Gibraltar remembers every time a ship passes safely through the strait, every time a garrison holds a defensive position against superior forces, every time competence triumphs over chaos. That's memorial enough.